colleagues, speakers, delegates from all around the world. I am Sarquis, Secretary for Foreign Trade and Economic Affairs of Brazil's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm pleased to introduce this session on financing the sustainable low-carbon bioeconomy, alongside my co-chair for this session, Mrs. Lynn Côté, Cleantech lead of the Export Development Canada Agency. As you will certainly hear from the many panels and keynotes in this conference, we are not on track to meet the world's climate goals. And one of the reasons is that the low-carbon bioenergy and bioeconomy are not growing fast enough to meet the projected need of all major climate and sustainable development projections, and scenarios geared at keeping the average global temperature rise well below 2 degrees and ideally below 1.5 degrees. This conference has sessions looking at different aspects such as regulation, technology, policies, sustainability, incentives, cooperation, and markets. It aims particularly to promote appropriate financial instruments with the right price, conditions, and risk acceptance. We should be well positioned here. The world economy is in general terms not starved for capital. At the same time, a growing wave of green finance can rebalance global funding flows in favor of assets and projects that contribute to the fight against climate change. These trends are very hard to track due to different definitions and procedures. But to give you just one data point, multilateral development banks have seen over 61% increase in climate finance from 2013 to 2019. That is, from 18% to 29% of their total lending, a ratio that keeps growing fast. However, is bioeconomy properly set up to ride this growing wave? Is this green and climate financing movement paying attention to bioenergy commensurate with its role in the climate solutions portfolio? I'm sad to say that the answer so far is no. IRENA's 2020 report on the global landscape of renewable energy finance contends that bioenergy is receiving about 89 cents for every $100 invested in renewable energy. This is less than 1%. Most of these investments, 77%, is going into the already mature, low-risk, regulated markets of solar, PV, and onshore wind, which are already competitive and lucrative and be supported by regular commercial finance. Against this background and taking advantage of the broad and diverse experience of our speakers, this panel will discuss the steps that need to be taken so that bioenergy can take advantage of the incoming climate finance wave instead of missing it. Giving the speakers different backgrounds in the financial sector, they will each provide a valuable perspective on what their respective institutions are doing in the bioenergy and bioeconomy field. Whether green finance is duly considering bioenergy's relevance in the global energy transition, and what could be done by different stakeholders to boost investments in bioenergy. Finally, and before introducing our speakers and giving the floor to my colleague Lynn, I will raise here some questions that we hope to see addressed, either in our speakers' presentations or during the interactive questions and sessions. Given their tremendous weight and influence, not only financially, but as trendsetters and leaders for other institutions, shouldn't major international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the New Development Bank be more active in building their own internal expertise in bioenergy, bioeconomy, and promoting technologies like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage? Would an internationally agreed sustainability governance framework succeed in boosting finance for sustainable bioenergy? The low-carbon bioeconomy sector, including advanced biofuels and biomaterials, is based on tradable commodities competing against a long-established and long-subsidized oil industry, and is subject to many uncertainties related to oil and feedstock prices. What features should specific financial products and de-risking mechanisms have to address these? Are there specific projects, policies, or credit lines that could serve as example and show the path forward? I'm happy to introduce the speakers that will address these questions. Mafalda Duarte is the CEO of Climate Investment Funds, an 8.5 billion multilateral fund managed by the World Bank that has supported climate action in 72 developing countries for over a decade. She has prior expertise in the World Bank itself, other multilateral development banks, organizations, and governments, including the African Development Bank, always at the intersection of climate action and international development. Petrônio Cançado is the Director of Credit and Guarantees of the Brazilian Development Bank, BNDES. He has had a long and successful career in credit and investment analysis and asset and equity management. BNDES is one of the largest development banks in the world and is the most important actor in renewable energy investments in Brazil. Mr. Cançado will tell us how BNDES supports the bioeconomy. Leisa Souza heads the Climate Bond Initiative's actions related to the green bond market and sustainable agricultural financing in Brazil. The Climate Bonds Initiative is an international organization working to mobilize bond market finance for climate change solutions. The CBI is one of the leading providers of private standards and certification for what would qualify as green in green finance, and they have worked on criteria for financing sustainable bioenergy. Dan Roberts is the president and CEO of Nawitka Capital Advisors, a Canadian firm that provides advice on strategic direction and raises capital for companies in the renewable energy, clean technology, forest product industries, as well as in the emerging bioeconomy. He has more than 30 years experience in the financial service sector and can enrich our discussions with a private sector perspective on the challenges of bringing green finance to the bioeconomy. Xian is the Vice President and Chief Operations Officer of the New Development Bank. The NDB is a recent entrant in the multilateral development bank arena and is committed to supporting infrastructure and sustainable development projects in BRICS and other emerging economies. The NDB is pioneering the issuance of bonds that comply with green finance standards. Patricia Genelhu is the head of sustainable and impact investing at BTG Pactual Bank, a Brazilian financial company that operates in the markets of investment banking, wealth management, asset management, corporate lending, and sales and trading. Patricia has prior experience in managing green portfolios, including for sustainable timberland management and in agribusiness, areas that interface strongly with the sustainable bioeconomy. Ladies and gentlemen, we look forward to hearing from our speakers, coming from diverse backgrounds and from institutions that can play a key role in directing green finance to the bioeconomy. I will now pass the floor to my co-chair, Mrs. Lynn Côté. Thank you very much.
Hello, bonjour, hola. My name is Lynn Côté, and I'm the Cleantech lead in Export Development Canada's Cleantech team. I've been in this role since 2013, and in that time have worked with companies across all cleantech sectors, including biofuels. Thank you to the organizers of the Biofuture Summit and my colleagues at Natural Resources Canada for the invitation to moderate this panel alongside His Excellency Ambassador Sarquis. EDC is a crown corporation that operates as a commercial financial institution. We provide an array of financial solutions to cleantech companies that include credit insurance solutions, bonding guarantees, various debt instruments, and equity. Supporting Canada's cleantech sector is a priority for EDC, and the corporation has been the largest provider of financial services to the Canadian cleantech sector for several years. At EDC, we have supported more than $11 billion in cleantech since 2012, and last year alone, we provided support to 288 companies for a total business volume of $4.5 billion. We were also the first Canadian issuer of a green bond in 2014, and since then have issued 5 bonds for a combined value of $1.4 billion. The combined GHG reduction impact corresponds to taking approximately 1.3 million passenger vehicles off the road per year. We also launched an investment matching program last year to support cleantech companies during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we work closely with our partners in the governments as well, alongside BDC, SCTC, and Global Affairs Canada, to jointly manage our customers and ensure they are receiving the full suite of federal support that's available, including from EDC. For the biofuels sector, we have seen different types of support required. For biofuel companies with established fuels, typically those that are first generation like corn ethanol, the support requested is often protection of receivables via our credit insurance solutions. Where things have been more challenging is for the next generation fuels. These challenges have been based on the following factors, which the Government of Canada has made progress on addressing through its A Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy statement in fall 2020, as well as the recent budget 2021. New technology that has not been proven at large scale, capital intensity required to build the production facilities, and a lack of policy and regulatory uncertainty. Historically, Canada has been a global leader in developing innovative clean technologies, but has struggled with commercial scale-up, export, and industry adoption. Several recent announcements by the federal government, as well as the coming into force of the regulatory requirement for Canada's Clean Fuel Standard in December 2022, are expected to close the gap in providing the support required by industry. Looking at Budget 2021, the federal government proposed to invest $1.5 billion to establish a clean fuels fund to support the build-out of new clean fuel production capacity, establish biomass supply chains, and develop enabling codes and standards in a manner that complements federal carbon pollution pricing, regulatory efforts, and other federal programming. Another important budget announcement is the $1 billion to support large-scale clean technology projects and to help draw in private sector investments for these projects. The government also proposed $5 billion be poured into the Net Zero Accelerator, a fund that invests in rapidly expanding decarbonization projects. The budget also announced plans to publish a green bond framework in the next few months as officials prepare to issue its first green bond over the next fiscal year. The budget stated that it would be the first of many. The first bond will target $5 billion in investments. Budget documents stated these bonds could be used to fund green infrastructure, clean tech, or conservation. Finally, in the budget, we saw $55 million that the government proposed to invest in wood-based innovations, which can be used in biofuel. So for Canadian biofuel companies, there's been a lot of recent positive news, and EDC's attention to the sector remains high. However, because they operate in global and competitive markets, there are challenges that remain that we will hear more about from our speakers. There are also increasingly opportunities following the myriad of net zero announcements from many countries and large corporations that also include a better understanding that many solutions will be required to meet these targets. Today, we look to the panel to provide insight on what impact the net zero announcements will have on the sector, and if they think the sector is represented or considered enough in the early plans they have seen. The impact of green bonds on the sectors, and whether biofuel projects are represented sufficiently in these bonds. And would there be a benefit to the sector to have more specific bonds? Are there certain markets that are moving faster than others to create the conditions for investment into biofuels? Do they think there is a lack of inclusion of biofuels projects in recent announcements because their success is very tied to having a predictable regulatory and pricing framework? Has the historic policy and regulatory uncertainty meant that investors have shied away from this class of assets? Is there a challenge because this industry is in many cases competing with conventional oil and gas? Is the capital intensity and time required to build facilities keeping investors away? New technologies need to be demonstrated at sufficient scale to show the market they are viable. How can that gap be filled so they can attain market acceptance? Biofuels can be created from many feedstocks. Are there still questions on their sustainability and carbon intensity levels? And finally, are there benefits in establishing international sustainability standards for the industry?
Hello, I'm Mafalda Duarte, head of the Climate Investment Funds, and I speak to you today as the world struggles to emerge from COVID-19 crisis, as we all know, while we are preparing to tackle the growing climate crisis. The bioeconomy can play a meaningful role in the decisions that societies make over the next decade to guide our responses to these crises. The decisions taken now by developing countries are especially critical to attaining our climate goals. In fact, I normally say that the solution to our climate crisis will come from developing countries. If we can't help developing countries in these critical years, we will be locking in decades of carbon intensive infrastructure and investments, essentially undermining all hope of limiting global temperatures to within safe limits. We have at the moment an unprecedented opportunity to carve out a new development trajectory, one that is not really based on a zero-sum game of economic growth at the expense of nature. We know that climate action can accelerate the recovery by increasing economic resilience, improving health, and creating jobs. Much of this action must focus on society's fractured relationship with the natural world. Nature-based solutions to climate change are a key component of an effective climate response and sustainable development. The most recent IPCC report notes that agriculture, forestry, and other land use accounted for 24% of global greenhouse gas emissions in 2010. Reducing these greenhouse gas emissions from these sectors while simultaneously using the land sector to remove CO2 from the atmosphere is really critical to limiting warming to 1.5 centigrade threshold. The new climate economy report postulates that nature-based solutions for climate mitigation could reach 30% of the world's mitigation potential. Financial institutions like the multilateral development banks, who are our close partners, need to pay more attention to the role of bioeconomy in delivering climate solutions and helping developing countries bounce back from COVID-19. It is more important than ever to signal to them and other key stakeholder partners that there will be large-scale concessional resources available in the short term to finance low-carbon and climate-resilient activities, so that these investments are prioritized as part of the efforts to recover from COVID-19 and part of the efforts as tackling COVID-19 to move us towards the zero-carbon economy. Additionally, developing country governments need the signal so that they can prioritize key policy reforms and investment decisions, and so that the private sector needs and so that the private sector have also the visibility into and can plan for upcoming investment opportunities in the short term which can then pave the way for much larger institutional capital to come in a longer time frame. This is where the climate investment funds come in. We are the largest source of concessional climate finance for 6 multilateral development banks and have provided a vital collaborative platform from which these institutions have been able to accelerate investments into higher risk, higher impact sectors and regions for independently verified transformational outcomes in clean energy, energy access, resilience building, and sustainable forest management. Overall, we have more than 350 projects in 72 countries, and these projects are delivering significant impact on the ground. They are contributing towards the generation of more than 27 gigawatts of new clean power capacity. They are improving energy access for 10 million people and over 300,000 businesses, providing greater climate resilience for more than 45 million people, and the sustainable management of 30 million hectares of forests. We also estimate, using economic modeling, the impact of our energy portfolio on job creation and economic value added, and can say that according to our current estimates, we have generated 1.9 million person years of direct employment during construction and 76,000 direct jobs during operations, and have contributed to more than 40 billion in direct and indirect economic value added. Let's come back to bioenergy. Our work on bioenergy is not extensive, but it is impactful. One area where we invest is wood-fired cook stoves. As we know, traditional stoves tend to be inefficient. They require large volumes of fuel wood or charcoal, and this contributes to significant deforestation and poses health risks due to the in-house smoke and soot accumulation. In Honduras, our project that is being funded by us and implemented by the Inter-American Development Bank in partnerships with the Netherlands Development Organization, we established a national clean cook stove quality standard, reinvigorated the local cook stove manufacturing and delivery of efficient cook stoves to communities. The interesting thing in Honduras was that our project, what it seeks to achieve is really create a private market for clean cook stoves. And therefore, try to reduce the dependence on subsidies. At least for the segments of the economy and the population that can afford them. Similarly, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's estimated that 84% of all harvested wood is used for charcoal and firewood. So our project that is being implemented by the World Bank is promoting the production and marketing of energy efficient cook stoves in Kinshasa, and has been able to significantly cut their production costs. As of last year, over 58,000 cook stoves had been distributed through our program. We also seek sustainable energy practices in relation to forest management. And one such example is in Burkina Faso, where the arid and semi-arid ecosystems have high carbon sequestration potential, but agriculture expansion, the overgrazing, bushfires, and fuel wood and charcoal production have been a threat to the environment. So we are promoting the use of organic mass from the existing cattle production, which can then be converted into fuel for cooking, manure to fertilize the lands, sprayed as an insecticide, or converted into natural gas. And there it's estimated that a single biodigester preserves around 0.3 3 hectares of forest per year, and we have promoted the establishment of more than 2,500 of them. In Brazil, we are collaborating with the Inter-American Development Bank and Inocas, a private sector startup company, in piloting to establish the first sustainable macaúba-based silvipastoral agroforestry value chain. The macaúba palm tree, as probably most people here today know, is native to Brazil. It is an oil-producing plant with very high potential for biofuel production, as well as other uses in several industries, in addition to being able to be forage for the livestock. And unlike the more commonly cultivated African oil palm, the macaúba is drought resistant and grows in pastures outside of the typical rainforest zone. So our project with Inocas and Inter-American Development Bank is in the Cerrado region in Brazil. And there's a very large potential to have extensive areas of macaúba plantations in Brazil, while growing crops at the same time after year 3 of the tree being in its growth. So this clearly offers an alternative to the traditional single crop African palm plantations, which really tend to result in degraded land and deforestation. The macaúba can produce about 1 metric ton of oil and 1.8 metric tons of fodder per hectare, which is higher yield, by some estimates 6 times higher than soy, the main plant that is used for biofuel in Brazil. As of March last year, Inocas had supported the farmers and the landowners to plant 502 hectares of macaúba trees on 26 farms, and 23 of which are smallholder farms and 3 being large rural producers. These are just a few examples of how our resources can bring the skills and resources of the multilateral development banks to tackle different aspects of the bioeconomy. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share our experiences, and we very much look forward to partnering with others that are aiming to drive new investments and relevant investments in this very important area of bioeconomy. Thank you very much.
Hello. Firstly, I would like to thank you, Mr. Sarquis, the chairman of this panel, my colleagues here, as well as everybody who is willing to take time and watch this video, this debate about sustainability, financing of biofuels, green finance. This is a very important part in BNDES' agenda. It's in our goal. And firstly, I think it's important to put in context the whole of Brazil in sustainability. So 1/3 of the forests worldwide are in the legal Amazon region. We have 60% of our territory with native vegetation. So I think Brazil has a very important role in this front, and as BNDES is the Development Bank of Brazil, this is an enormous challenge for us, a huge responsibility, but as well as a very important opportunity. And this is not new for us. I mean, Brazil takes care of sustainability for a long time. We have a very regulation that is very favoring sustainability. And the bank has created a sustainability department over 30 years ago. And we have, I think, a very good experience, a lot of knowledge that came from this experience, and we are willing to share that with the public. This is maybe one of the big differences in the way the bank is acting right now. We created a department a relationship department to talk with the companies in Brazil, the big companies in Brazil, and about sustainability, their ESG goals. And we are trying to consolidate the aims of the companies in Brazil. And I can say that they are all willing to do more and to raise the bar regarding their sustainability goals and ESG goals. So the bank is an important actor in this front, and I think there will be very good progress because when we do things together, all those matters are very complex and they need cooperation between the private sector, the government sector, all the banks. And so I think BNDES is in a good position, and Brazil is in a very important position to participate in this segment. Firstly, I'd like to give some highlights about the bank in the past, how we operated. We managed some funds regarding reforestation to avoid deforestation and to incentivize and develop new technologies on sustainable economy. So we have a lot of material in this front, things that have gone fine, some projects that have not gone that fine. And I think one of the main lessons that is important to share is that it's fundamental to take care of the people that live in the regions as well that are being affected. In this sense, I would like to highlight that we have a huge population living in the Amazon region, and they have the worst indications on the social front. Just to give an example, on sanitation, the worst indexes in sanitation in the country are in the Amazon region. And it's very difficult to talk about sustainability, development, without taking care of this kind of thing. So this is one lesson that we come from the past. But in addition to that, I think another activity that the bank has done in the past is finance energy. It's impossible to talk about sustainable investments without talking about energy. And in this front, I think Brazil has done well as well. We have a very clean matrix of energy in the country, and the bank participated giving financing to those investments in the past. For example, wind projects, solar projects, they are now taking more importance, and we are willing to share that with the private sector, because when you look ahead, the levels of investments are very huge, and it's fundamental to have more investors willing to participate. And on the other front, on the energy side, I would highlight the biofuels. And in this front, Brazil, I think we have to mention the alcohol program that we underwent in the country. And that was very important, is still very important. I think we can share that with the world as well. One of the main points is that we have almost 30% of our gasoline here is mixed with ethanol, and that has a huge impact on the environmental front and on capturing carbon. So that is one thing that should be done in other countries as well. And one of the most important things to do that is to have more countries producing ethanol. So the technology involved could be shared, and we could support this kind of thing. There is a lot of financial engineering on this front, but it's important to communicate well, to tell those things, to explain and how it works, and to have some bonds and financing that we can really measure the impact and show to the investors and to the community as a whole what is being done, the achievements, and this is fundamental for those good progress that have been done in the past. They can spread through other regions and make more impact. On this front as well, we have in the past we have financed a lot of investments in research. For example, second generation ethanol, biogas, and other kinds of biofuel. And it's important very important for development research. The more doing that together with companies and together with investors, and having more people willing to do this kind of investment is really a great opportunity. And in addition to that, I think that the banks and the financial sector as a whole, they have a very important, they could act more in putting price to bioassets and social assets. I think those kind, for example, carbon credits, the markets are very small. They're still very small, but they're growing fast. And it's very important to give the right price. So in addition to putting bonds, have a good taxonomy, having some standards, so people can understand what is being is done on the project, measuring the impacts, saying that, communicating that well. It's also very important to specify and put price to the financial assets related to the bioeconomy. So that I think is one of our goals as well. And we think that maybe in the short term, those markets will grow a lot. And BNDES in Brazil can make a difference by being an articulator, in addition to the balance sheet, being an articulator and between the private sector, the government, and other foreign institutions willing to participate in developing this market. So that's it. I'm really happy to be here and having the opportunity to talk a little bit about the whole of BNDES and Brazil in this front. Thank you a lot.
Hello to those watching us from all over the world. My name is Leisa Souza, and I'm the acting head of Latin America for the Climate Bonds Initiative. It's my pleasure to be here today to share how green bonds are financing the bioeconomy. And before diving into the specific sector of our panel today, I wanted to give a global overview on the sustainable finance market and how it's been developing. So the sustainable finance market has been dominated by green bonds, but we do see in recent year other labels as sustainable, social, and pandemic emerging. So we look at this both on the amount issued and also the number of issues coming to market, and this really demonstrates the growing appetite for labeled bonds. Now, moving into green, it's really important to kind of look at the concept and what is a green bond. So green bonds are debt financing or refinancing instruments that can be issued by companies, financial, non-financial, or public entities where funds are being directed to green assets and projects. So when we're talking about green bonds, we're talking about financing low carbon and resilient investment across energy, infrastructure, agriculture, and other key sectors of the economy. If we consider investments for bioenergy specifically, the International Energy Agency estimates $60 billion will be needed per year by 2030, and this value increases to $200 billion per year between 2050 and 2060 if we want to keep within the 2 degrees of global warming set by the Paris Agreement. And this figure includes bioelectricity and transport biofuel production. So bearing in mind the 93 trillion global bond market, there is a considerable potential for financing bioenergy as well as a bioeconomy more widely through green bonds. So if we look here at the graph as well, we'll see the use of proceeds, and 33% are being directed towards energy, 27% towards building, 90% towards transport, and 4% towards land use. But the rapid growth of global green bond market has shown in practice that this is a promising channel to finance climate investments. And in 2020, the global green market reached a cumulative $1 trillion with around 300 billion issued over the last 2 years each year. Looking at the development in Latin America, issuances in Latin America are also growing. They represent still around 2% of the global market, and Brazil is the second largest market in the region. Since the country's inaugural green bond back in 2015, the market has grown from $549 million to approximately 8 billion US dollars. So this is a considerable growth. Most of Brazil's issuances have been domestic and around 76%. And renewable energy and land use continue to be the most funded categories in Brazil. This really follows a global trend in terms of the use of proceeds. So renewable energy is the popular use of proceed, representing 46% of Brazil's issuance, and land use 34%, which is quite considerable considering the 4% I had just mentioned briefly in terms of the global green bond market. Another interesting figure from Brazil is a predominance of financial corporates that account for approximately 78% of the total amount issued. So here we have a few figures that I mentioned in terms of Brazil's green bond market and the use of proceeds. So we see this increasing over the years. We've closed 2020 with almost 2.2 billion in issuances. And as I mentioned, in terms of the use of proceeds, we see quite a difference in terms of the land use sector specifically. So considering the bioeconomy, energy and land use are two important sectors, and they show that this is already a possibility on how green bonds are being used in Brazil. And one of the most important things when we talk about green is identifying eligible green assets and projects. And this is central for market integrity. And this has been one of the climate bonds' major role in the market. Back in 2013, we published the first green taxonomy, which it's here in the screen for you, a summary version of it. And the taxonomy indicates the sectors of the economy that need investment if we were to keep within the 2-degree limit set by the Paris Agreement. Bioenergy is one of these sectors, so there is a clear recognition of its role in the transition to a low-carbon economy. In addition to the taxonomy, the climate bond also coordinates the development of sector criteria, and we have a dedicated bioenergy criteria. You can see it here in the energy column. And it sets specific mitigation and adaptation and resilience metrics that issuers need to demonstrate to show that they really have green, robust credentials. And this is why the criteria is so important. It's because it really signals to the market what is eligible for investment. The bioenergy criteria also provide guidances on the type of projects that are eligible to be included in green bonds. And the current scope of the criteria is for processing facilities, converting biofuel and biomass into electricity and heat, and also into liquid fuels. And there is an exclusion in terms of a few feedstocks, which are woody biomass, third-generation biofuels, and biodegradable municipal solid waste. However, as the criteria is reviewed on a regular basis, there is chance for reconsidering this and the inclusion, for instance, of algae biofuels when the technology and the market for advanced biofuels are more developed, providing the necessary metrics that we need for the criteria. So moving here to the bioenergy criteria and the identification of eligible projects and assets. A few examples of eligible project and assets are biofuel producing facilities, fuel preparation process facilities, pre-treatment facilities for thermal liquefaction, pyrolysis and gasification, biorefinery facilities, energy production facilities, heating and cooling facilities, electricity generation facilities using biomass, including those, of course, within the scope and with CCS, and supporting infrastructure. And here we're considering transmission lines connecting these biofuel facilities to the grid. It's important to go a bit through the criteria rationale because it touches on important issues regarding sustainability, such as life cycle assessment, land use change, and feedstock. And it's really important to go a bit through these points to really demonstrate why the criteria is so important in terms of market guidance. So here you'll see in step 1 that there's the mitigation requirement that looks at meeting the established GHG emission thresholds. What do we mean when we say these GHG emission thresholds? So we understand that bioenergy is driven by GHG mitigation. And of course, they also may generate GHG emissions over their life cycle due to land use change, feedstock production and processing, blending, transport, and distribution. So it's important to look at how these fuels are more efficient than conventional fuels, and holding a life cycle assessment that really looks into feedstock production, feedstock processing, biofuel and bioenergy production, biofuel storage and blending, and intermediate and final transportation. The bioenergy criteria recognizes the Renova Calci, which is a calculator that is part of the Renova Bio program, as a proxy to measure life cycle assessment and identify emission threshold. These emission thresholds, they vary according to the facility. So if we're talking about a biomass in heating and cogeneration facility, the threshold is 16 grams of CO2 per megajoule produced. If a facility is producing biofuels for transport, it's 18.8 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule produced. And when we're talking about heating and cooling in cogeneration facilities, it's also 16 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule produced, plus an 80% energy efficiency threshold. This brings us to the second point, which is also really important, which is looking at the reduction of the risk of indirect land use and impact, ILUC, which is important and which Brazil knows so well. And facilities, then they should also demonstrate that they're reducing the risk of indirect use, land use impact. And facilities, they need to demonstrate this by reducing the risk of indirect land use impact through, certified RSB low module, optional module, or providing evidence that they meet ILUC risk through a yield increase, so that the feedstock that is being produced is not causing any additional land conversion. Unused and degraded land, also that demonstrating that the feedstock produced is not being produced in land that was previously cultivated or not considerable arable, and use of waste and residues, that all raw material is derived from existing supply chains and does not require dedicated production. So these are important points in terms of mitigation. If we look at adaptation and resilience, it is also important to cover this, to demonstrate, of course, these sustainability credentials, which are so important for investors and for issuers. So when we're looking at adaptation and resilience, we're looking at the conduction of a climate risk assessment, where you have really the development of an adaptation plan that identify risks and does this via an adaptation and resilience checklist, which is in the criteria. And an important point is also the compliance with the best practice standards in terms of feedstock. So the use of either RSB, RTRS, FIC, or ISSC+, and more recently the Climate Bonds agriculture criteria, to demonstrate that feedstock is being sourced sustainably. Another important point in terms of adaptation and resilience is also food security. So we also indicate and suggest that the RSB Food Security Assessment Guidelines are looked upon, and that the Global Hunger Index should be checked to see if feedstock is being sourced from a country where there is food insecurity, and whether feedstock is being produced in a country with low or moderate ranking within the index. So just recapping quite quickly, it's important when you're talking about the eligibility of eligible projects and assets, and here remember that I'm talking about the bioenergy criteria, is to look at the life cycle assessment of GHG emissions, energy efficiency of facilities that are using biofuels and biomass, making sure that there's certification of the RSB ILUC module or evidence in terms of compliance with the RSB ILUC module, which is the yield increase, unused and degraded land, and use of waste and residues. Also, the assessment against the adaptation and resilience checklist, so making sure you cover all aspects of the checklist, and certification of feedstock against one of the approved best practice standards, and assessment of the proposed standard or certification scheme, and information about the Global Hunger Index ranking of the country where the feedstock is being produced. Before we go into, I think, a bit of the challenges of the green bond market, I selected a few examples within our database that demonstrate how bioenergy and bioeconomy projects and assets are being financed. And here it's worth pointing that the Climate Bonds Green Database not only includes certified deals, for instance, considering the bioenergy criteria, which I just presented, but it also looks at different labeled instruments. And we consider to be included in our database, the eligible sectors and eligible use of proceeds based on our taxonomy, and sector-specific metrics and indicators which are consistent with the Paris Agreement, thus the importance of the bioenergy criteria. So regarding bioeconomy, within our database, we have the Stora Enso. It's a Finnish company that has issued 6 deals to finance bioeconomy. Its green bond framework includes materials and innovative solutions in packaging and wooden construction. It has received an SPO, and it has directed the use of proceeds toward the financing of research, development, and equipment used in the manufacturing of products of the bioeconomy within the eligible projects, and investments in the maintenance and production of facilities that manufacture low carbon products based on renewable materials. So a lot in terms of R&D with the purpose of replacing fossil fuel based and non-renewable materials with bio-based alternatives. So this is an interesting example. When we look at Brazil, we have 4 deals within our database that are green. We have another 3 that have come to market in the meanwhile, which we are still assessing. But to share these are bioenergy issuances in Brazil, and they're increasing with the renewable energy category. It's still much dominated by the wind and solar sectors. The first certified deal to finance biofuel production under the bioenergy criteria was structured by Ecoagro back in 2019. However, due to market circumstances, it was not settled. However, later in February 2020, FS Bioenergia issued the first green CRA and has come to market. And over the past 2 years, this was for corn ethanol, forgive me. And over the past 2 years, a number of issuances have been made by biofuel companies. The proceeds of green issuances have gone to either corn or sugarcane ethanol production, and including cogeneration. And proceeds have also been used for the processing and industrialization of feedstock, as well as working capital to cover costs with crops, biomass, and other agricultural products. Bioenergy issuances have happened across other sustainable labels, and we expect to see these increase over the next years due to Brazil's leading role as a major biofuel producer and exporter. There are significant investment opportunities in feedstock production and expansion, and also in new and existing units, and other production units that are being built. And last year we published a roadmap called Unlocking Brazil's Green Investment Potential for Agriculture, which identifies 30.6 billion potential by 2030 for the bioenergy sector. So this does demonstrate that Brazil has a pipeline of green projects that are ready to come to market, and that can be financed via green bonds. I think the constant challenge here is for the sector to continue to communicate its sustainability standards, particularly to address the global concerns we're so aware of, which is the competing land use, so the fuel versus food debate, biodiversity and deforestation. And also, of course, demonstrating that this is a viable alternative when we consider electrification, which is perceived, especially by the European and North American market, as a solution for decarbonizing the transport sector. And here in Brazil, we know that at least 78% of the fleet is flex fuel. And then if we look at projections, this will probably increase to 90% by 2030. So we believe that the climate bonds certification and criteria for biofuels can provide greater comfort on how to address these issues, as I had mentioned previously. And there is a role for all stakeholders in this process. So there's a role for investors, there's a role for issuers, financial institutions, regulators, policymakers in shifting capital towards green projects and assets while maintaining still this focus on financial returns. This is why the green bond market has been so successful. And the opportunity really lies on channeling private sector capital towards low carbon and climate resilient bioenergy projects and assets. And we see that green finance is no longer a niche, it's becoming mainstream, and all stakeholders, as I mentioned, have a role and a responsibility in developing and seizing this opportunity. So investors, while we have mobilized investors still need to make their demand more visible in terms of green bonds, because this will definitely encourage potential issuers to come to market with more deals. So I think this is what we're looking at when we talk about bioenergy and bioeconomy and even agriculture here in Brazil. Issuers also need to be ambitious in terms of exploring the opportunities of green bond financing. In bioenergy, it's clear Brazil sits on a pool of eligible green assets. So it's really important to align these with standards and guidelines to ensure robust credentials are being met, as well as disclosure. In terms of banks, they can act as market facilitators and should continue to educate clients on the green opportunities that exist and promote and generate deal flows that satisfy unmet investor demand. There is also a role for regulators and policymakers to making sure there are no obstacles to green bond market development, and also in proposing efficient solutions to stimulate the market, particularly in initial phases. In Brazil, we have, seen the support from government and also interest from regulators. And as I mentioned, green bonds and green finance have become mainstream. And what we've seen so far, of course, in Brazil is only the beginning. There's an untapped potential when we talk about bioenergy and bioeconomy. As I mentioned, we have 4 green deals here in Brazil. So we've seen Brazil's potential, and we've tested the pipeline, and there's huge opportunity to make Brazil one of the top leaders in green finance. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Hello, my name is Don Roberts, and I'm the CEO of Nawitka Capital Advisors. The presentation today focuses on key factors affecting the financing of the bioeconomy. Next slide. Specifically, I'm going to focus on answering 3 questions. The first is, and they're all with respect to the bioeconomy, of course. The first is the financial sector paying sufficient attention? Second, how can we reduce its complexity for investors? And third, does it offer unique investment opportunities? Next slide. Regarding the first question, does the economy get enough attention from the financial sector? Well, the answer is, it depends. And it depends on a number of factors, including the specific segment within the bioeconomy, as well as the complexity of the specific project in question. What we see is that in some cases, the bioeconomy does offer unique investment opportunities, and in others, it does not. A good example where it does not is in the power segment or the electricity segment, where biopower can work in some cases, but in many cases, in fact, the value proposition, in fact, is weaker than it is for other sources of green electrons, whether it be the solar or wind or hydro sector. The other thing to note is that in general, biomass-based projects are often more complex for investors to look at. And that's a challenge for financiers. It often results them passing on projects or increasing the cost of capital. So this leads really to the next question, and that is, how can we reduce the complexity for investors? Next slide. One way to do that is to look at what works outside the bioeconomy and the rest of the economy. And one thing that has worked is the use of credit rating systems. They're well established for looking at projects across the economy. And to give you a sense of how widely they're used, annually, there's almost 3 million credit ratings done on financing, and they support over $9.5 trillion in capital investments. So it's something widely used and has been quite successful. So the question is, how can we extend the proven benefits of credit rating to the biomass sector? Specifically, can we create what I would call a biomass supply credit rating? Because if we can, some of the potential benefits of these kind of biomass ratings or standards are reduced cost of funding, access to a larger pool of investors, and faster deployment of capital. Next slide. So what do standardized tools for biomass investment look like? Well, here's an example. On the right actually is a picture of a report that documents it in Canada, what's been done. And in fact, the governments of Canada and the US have financially supported the development of biomass supply credit rating standards. They're also known as BSCR standards. And they put about over $5 million over the last 5 years to support the development of these. And this set of standards has been led by the consulting firm CanMet, as well as the national energy labs in both Canada and the US. CanMet in Canada and Los Alamos and Idaho Labs in the US. It's also included a 150-member industry stakeholder group, as well as a 14-person advisory group, of which I'm a member. Next slide. So this BSCR standard is arguably the most rigorous framework that's been devised to date for assessing feedstock risk for investors. And it involves 6 general risk categories, which are identified with the different colors in this chart. And it also incorporates within that 28 risk factors and 126 specific risk indicators. So it's really quite rigorous and complete. Why is this needed? Next slide. Well, it's needed because the reality is that biomass supply chains, they're complex. And as I said before, that often confuses investors and causes them to sometimes pass on opportunities in this sector or charge more. And so what the BSR or biomass standards do is they essentially provide a blueprint for the capital markets to understand, specifically to understand what these risks are, how to mitigate them, and how to properly structure capital around them. Next slide. So participants across the financial spectrum in Canada and the US at this point are starting to recognize, use, and apply, I think, this innovation. And having said that, this whole move couldn't be, its objective is really to support the large and growing pool of capital that's looking to be deployed across the bioeconomy. Next slide. So I've mentioned that capital markets benefit from these standards. Having said that, they also provide benefits to governments and project developers, because you need the whole ecosystem, I would argue, to benefit from this. And I think they do. Next slide. So interest in the bioeconomy is increasing because of the rising need to decarbonize the global economy. And that's, again, why we need these tools. I say there's interest because of some interesting announcements that have been coming out as of late. One of the important ones that came out in April of this year when the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero Emissions, they pledged themselves to the mission of reaching zero carbon emissions by 2050. Well, that sounds good. Does it matter? Well, I would argue it does because of who they are. And they represent over 160 financial firms with roughly $70 trillion of assets under management. But we're also seeing this extend beyond the financial sector to the non-financial sector. And here what we see are some of the, at the bottom of the chart here, some of the leading non-financial firms are committing to zero net emissions, and all within specific timelines. And you can see from this list that there are a number of these household names within the corporate sector globally. Next chart. I now want to move on to my third question that I initially posed, and that is, does the bioeconomy offer unique investment opportunities? And I think it does. And it does, it really offers 2 pathways for investors to follow. The first is the transition to the circular bioeconomy with the substitution of low carbon bio-based products for high carbon intensity products, with the latter mostly, historically at least, coming from the fossil fuel sector. But there's a second pathway, which is, I would argue, wholly unique to the bioeconomy, and that's the role of forests and land use in reducing emissions and increasing removals of CO2 from the atmosphere. These are what we call, generally speaking, natural or nature-based climate solutions. Next slide. To understand how some corporations are seeing the opportunities within the bioeconomy, I'd like to do a case study and consider Shell, the oil company. And over the next 30 years, Shell expects to radically transform its product mix, and with a major shift towards lower carbon products. However, they're also increasing the emphasis on capturing and storing carbon. And within this, the special focus, and in fact the primary focus, is on using these nature-based solutions. And I want to share with you a quote that came from Shell's global CEO back in February of this year. And he said, quote, "I can imagine us working with nature to lock away maybe 300 million tons of carbon in forests, in wetlands, and soils," end quote. Well, that's pretty dramatic. So what you're seeing is companies like Shell are looking to pursue both of these pathways offered by the bioeconomy. And they hope to do this at scale. Next slide. This slide focuses on the first general pathway. And the bioeconomy really offers many opportunities to reduce the carbon intensity of products and contribute to a circular economy. You see on the left side of this chart really the fact that many different sources of biomass are available and produced by the agriculture sector, the forestry sectors, and in fact the aquatic sectors as well. Typically in a year, these three sectors produce roughly 25 billion tons of biomass. And they take that and they convert it into a series of products, which are then consumed in the food industry, the building sector, and the energy sector. And here in the chart on the right in the boxes, you see some of the specifics, applications. So that's positive. But to make this transition to a circular economy work economically, make it work financially, we're going to need to see a meaningful price on carbon. And right now, we don't have it high enough or broadly enough applied. And that's a concern. Next slide. I'd like to now turn to the second general pathway, this around natural climate solutions. And here, what we see is sustainable forestry and agriculture, in addition to conservation and restoration. They're now seen as central to climate change mitigation. And we're talking really a potential reduction of roughly 10 billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year through a combination of protecting intact lands, managing working lands, and restoring natural ecosystems. Next slide. So what are the prospects of actually implementing these natural climate solutions? Well, first of all, I would assert that the demand for these kinds of projects is arguably going to be much greater than the supply. One other issue is that few countries have really developed the legal and regulatory frameworks that are needed to ensure fair and transparent transactions in carbon offset trading. Furthermore, these nature-based solutions are likely to be concentrated in some of the poorest and most biodiverse regions of the world. They're also mostly likely to take place on lands that are held by indigenous peoples and local communities. So this is an issue because failure to adequately recognize community rights to carbon really poses a fundamental risk to the pursuit of these natural-based solutions, and we've got to be aware of it. I referred earlier to these biomass supply credit rating standards, and they could be a tool to help us here because they do have a social risk factor in its supply chain risk category. But it arguably needs to be further refined, I think, to adequately reflect some of these risks that I just mentioned above with regard to indigenous peoples and local communities. Next and final slide. So what do we conclude? Well, really, I posed three questions at the beginning, and I'd like to summarize with my three key conclusions which relate to those questions. First of all, it is not clear whether the financial sector is paying too little or too much attention to opportunities in the bioeconomy. As I said, it depends on the specific segments of the bioeconomy and the project's degree of complexity and perceived risk. So it's not clear. What is clear is that investment opportunities in the bioeconomy are often quite complex to analyze. And that is a barrier to financing. Now, one tool to reduce the complexity that we've talked about here are these biomass supply credit rating standards. Third conclusion is that the bioeconomy does indeed offer unique investment opportunities. Certainly, the nature-based climate solutions are one set of these opportunities, and they are, I've got to say, they're quite exciting for a number of investors. However, the demand for these projects could well significantly exceed the supply. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening and happy to address any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to attend this Biofuture Summit too. I'm very delighted to have this opportunity to sort of represent MDB for this very important session, which is about financing the bioeconomy, particularly the role of green bonds and financial institutions. But before I go into the discussions, I'm also very delighted to know that Ambassador Sarquis was a part of this the session, and we worked together in the MDB. He was my fellow vice president, so I'm very delighted, even virtually, to send my greetings to him as well. I understand this panel is focusing on the discussions about the green financing and particularly the financial institutions in terms of what kind of a trend that can go on, so that eventually considering much more strategically about bioenergy, bioeconomy, particularly about their projects in the financial institutions, the portfolios, not only in Brazil, but also globally, and how to address the concerns. Maybe first let me say a few things about New Development Bank. The New Development Bank was established by the 5 BRIC countries back to 2015, and our mandate is to finance infrastructure as well as address the fundamental concern of sustainable development. And over the past 5 years, I think that including in Brazil, we have a rapidly growing portfolio of our lending to the 5 member countries. In terms of the green financing, and in 2016, we issued the first green financial bond in China with renminbi $5 billion and also tenure of 5 years in China. I think that $5 billion is equivalent to something like 500 million US dollar, and proceeds of the green bonds were basically used for the MDB's financed projects, particularly in renewable energy and other green infrastructures as well, so that the bond issued in the Chinese financial market and also popularly welcomed by the investors. And also more recently, and the MDB issued another 5 billion renminbi for the SDG bond, even though SDG scope is much wider than just green bonds. However, I think that largely the proceeds were also used for the green activities under the MDB's portfolio, largely and in China. And specifically, MDB has not yet financed projects in bioenergy sectors, but we are very keen to see that we can be associated with our support into these very important sectors, particularly in Brazil to start with through BNDES and other financial institutions in Brazil already supported the green financing on the renewable energies. I hope that soon we can have opportunities to support the bioenergy projects in Brazil, hopefully in other member countries as well. To our knowledge, bioenergy typically enhance the energy access and reduce reliance on the fossil fuels, contributing to the global climate change agenda. However, bioenergy can also have some negative impacts if not well addressed in terms of its development and implementation in a proper manner. There was some sort of concern to be addressed, such as food security and the risk of reduced biodiversity and the challenges how to manage the economic competitiveness. But I think that so far the record, particularly on the positive side, I think strategically these issues can be well addressed, and also depending on the locations and the management of a production and process. And significant knowledge and competence are available to manage the risk as associated and try to capture the good opportunities for the follow-up. the complexity should not be the barrier to really against the development of bioenergy technologies. For example, we understand there were debates around the large-scale bioenergy plants that may be expensive to build and operate. However, there are also technologies available which can build much smaller sized plants for regional-based or community-based applications as opposed to the more centralized plants. And then I think the next relevant question might be that how that internationally agreed sustainability governance framework can succeed in mainstreaming sustainable bioenergy in financing. I think that definitely if that can be done, and that would help mainstream the sustainable bioenergies. One key aspect of such a framework, I believe, is to have an inclusive stakeholder process to identify best areas for bioenergy productions and appropriate production planning to mitigate any possible negative risk and impacts. And then I think that the other issue probably in my mind is whether bioeconomy sector and will be different in terms of the risk profile from other more established power sector, particularly with solar and the wind. I think that bioenergy sector probably fundamentally is not so significantly different from wind and solar projects, although they involve a very different set of risks, such as biodiversity, food security, as I mentioned earlier. A project should be assessed professionally in a comprehensive manner with all the elements considered to be able to build a good case for business and environmentally and sound and beneficial. The industry can provide good quality proposals with a clear articulation of the project risk and benefits to the financing institutions, despite of the complexities that might have been involved. This requires a good effort from both supply and demand of the financing. In terms of MDB's role and with regard to the sustainable and the low carbon bioeconomy in our portfolio for green financing, and I think that we believe bioenergy represents a major type of renewable energy. According to the international studies available, the long-term climate change the targets cannot be achieved without good efforts towards bioenergy. And bioenergy can play a significant role in almost all energy sectors, including heating, transport, power, generation, and so on. Currently, biofuels may be the only practical alternative to fossil fuels for aviation, shipping, and heavy freight transport. So I think potentially we see that that can be further enhanced in terms of their utilization and also to play a more environmentally and sound alternative. The MDB member countries do have a bioenergy as potentially a solution to address climate change agenda. For example, particularly in Brazil, the target is to increase the share of sustainable biofuels in Brazilian energy mix to approximately, say, 18% by 2030 by expanding biofuel consumption, increasing ethanol supply, including by increasing the share of advanced biofuels, and also increasing the share of biodiesels in the diesel mix. Brazil probably is a global leader in these aspects and also setting up national policies that establish goals to reduce the emissions by increasing the use of biofuels. I think that the policy is mostly welcome, but also depending on, as I said, how eventually to translate the policy into the good practices in the implementations. And MDB is currently and working on its climate change and action plans. And also country by country, with a different profile and the conditions, we also want to eventually develop our strategies on the climate change in a differentiated manner. In Brazil, probably in other countries, we certainly would consider putting these areas into our climate change actions. And our sustainable financing policy framework governs the bank's issuing of the green, social, and sustainability and debt instruments, including the use and management of bond proceeds. We see a lot of potentials eventually we can use, as we said so far, and the proceeds of such bonds in China and into other countries, including in Brazil. And also the project selection and evaluation process should be put into a globally recognized country-specific framework, and also with areas of the concerns regarding reporting and disclosure. So in general, I think all the projects which MDB has financed or going to finance are designed and implemented in compliance with the standards set in the bank's environmental and social framework, as well as relevant environmental and social country systems. Currently, bioenergy is not yet specifically emphasized in such a framework, but we think that we're at a stage reviewing such a framework, and bioenergy certainly can be considered into this framework. So largely, I think that for this panel, I believe that we can learn from other panel members, even though virtually, so that we can see how MDB can also play an important role in countries such as Brazil for the bioenergy, and so that eventually we'll see that can be served as one of our efforts towards climate change globally, such an agenda. Thank you very much for inviting me. I hope the discussion can be very productive on the important subject, and also I appreciate I can also have one way or the other the access to the inputs from other panel members. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Thank you for the invitation of being part of this panel. It's a pleasure to talk to you today among such contributing participants. I'm Patricia Genelhu. I'm representing BTG Pactual, the largest investment bank in Latin America, and I'll try to add a bit of our understanding on the bioeconomy and how financing such segment will be important moving forward. So I'll just share a presentation as guidance. So hopefully you can now see my screen. So basically, what we have been seeing in the financial markets is this major capital flow towards ESG and outflows from what's not ESG. So not only that has been happening with a strong appetite during these last years, but that has also become a global tendency, so a global trending topic. So one thing that was European and has also experienced some strength in North America is now really coming towards the emerging markets, and it's actually influencing pricing, not only on equity perception, but also on debt capital markets. And when we look forward to what has been going on as tendency and what could we experiment going forward, we actually understand that this capital movement is going to get deeper and deeper. So we have, for example, institutional investors that are willing not only to allocate on ESG assets only, but they are actually willing to pay more for that. And in BTG Pactual, we have been taking a deep look on ESG for at least 6 years now. And we have recently started to analyze the financial markets and how the things are moving globally. So we decided to create a sustainable and impact investing division in BTG back in January 2020. What we have been doing across that division is actually to boost the local market towards sustainability and impact as part of structuring financial products. So within our asset management, for example, we have been structuring funds that have those goals. We have been developing a carbon credits platform. That means that we are also related with decarbonization credits out of our bioenergy mix, and we want to incentivize a low carbon economy in that space. And we are also getting deeper and very active on the investment banking activities. So when we talk about green bonds, about transition bonds, or even on sustainability linked instruments that have been raising up, this is something that is really active for us. So we are actually boosting Latin Americans' representativeness in that space. And when we talk about our own credit portfolio, we have been also engaging with our debtors on bringing sustainability practices into our borrowing structurings. So when we talk about the potential labels, I'm sure that Leisa and the other participants have already covered, but we see a major vocation for green bonds, sustainability linked bond structuring when we talk about the biofuel segment. And that has actually increased the bar in terms of sustainability practices and standards that bring to the market or even to bilateral transactions. So not only we see that labeling and issuance could be an upside, but actually doing that with a huge consistency is something that is being more and more demanded, as a simple label could be perceived as greenwashing if you don't really have the fundamentals behind it to bring something really ambitious that investors and your creditor would actually perceive as something that has substance. And when we talk about the global rise of that market, we see a major trend on expectations moving forward. So not only that has been scaling up during these last years, but the acceleration mood that we see there in the pipeline in this first quarter in 2021, for instance, is really significant. And when we look forward, not only we will have that actually being accelerated, but the types of labels are actually being more diverse. So we are not only doing the green bonds that are really traditional, but we are also bringing in some other different labels as we might have covered already. So when we talk about Brazilian market specifically, we have been scaling up all the activity in that space as well. So we have been increasing all the things that we are doing in that space in terms of segments that's being more and more perceived as diversified. And when we talk about the activities in local and offshore markets, that's something that's actually growing. And in terms of volumes, it's really gaining expression. So when we talk about BTG, we have also entered in that space. And as a bank that has this credit portfolio, what we are doing is to actually try to increase the work that we are doing within sustainable agribusiness and biofuels specifically. So last year we came out to the market with our first private placement that was a green labeled one. And we had developed this very consistent framework that comprises renewable energy as one of our targets. And not only we have done that first private placement, but we have also done a second issuance with 2 development banks. And we have also came out to the offshore market with a public offering of our first green bond in January this year. All of those proceeds are actually going to be allocated into transactions that have clear environmental benefits. And within that eligible portfolio, the biofuel segment is the most representative one for us at BTG. So that should be something we will be engaging even further when we look at our credit portfolio activities. And in the financial markets, we talk about the debt capital markets, we are very active in that space as well. So we have done several distributions in these last years. And one innovation that I would like to mention was 1 or 2 months ago when we came out with our first bilateral loan with a company here in Brazil that is really representative at the agribusiness segment. And we came out with a sustainability linked structure that would actually motivate this biofuel producer to increase its share on familiar agriculture origination, and also be related to reverse logistics in terms of the packing that were used for agribusiness defensives. So this is something that we are really motivating within our clients, which is their own engagement towards sustainability practices, and that being translated into a credit structure was something very important for us as a major step in BTG. So when we talk about the opportunities on origination insights for 2021, we see among several segments many opportunities related to renewable energy and energy efficiency due to the climate change urgency. So when we talk about financing bioeconomy, not only we have been engaging with the decarbonization credits, with this trend on carbon credits, and not only on that, but also on IREX related to biofuels as a potential, but we are also increasing our credit portfolio. We see a major space there to be more active and more engaged with companies that are willing to finance its own activities, its growth, with structures that are going to be related with sustainability practices and use of proceeds that are actually allocated to increase those activities more and more. And on the debt capital markets, we are also seeing this major trend, not only on green bonds getting larger in terms of growth in their volumes that are accessing the market, but also in other types of labels. They are translating this appetite among the companies to bring transparency, to bring their labels and their own company positioning towards sustainability agenda. And we have been seeing premiums that are motivating these companies, not only in intangible manners, but also in tangible manners of that to happen. And that's what basically BTG has been devoted to. So we believe that financing bioeconomy is something that is really crucial for our ongoing activities, and that's going to be even deeper moving forward.